and welcome to The Last Picture House, the podcast that takes an in-depth look at classic films. I'm your host, Marcus Lovett, and joining me in the Quantico Mess Hall is Last Picture House panelist Maria Suzuki. Hi, Maria.
Ciao.
This episode, Jonathan Demme's 1991 thriller, Silence of the Lambs. How did a modestly budgeted film about the pursuit of a serial killer win the Big Five Oscars? And how does the film continue to provoke audiences 30 years after its release? We'll discuss the making of the film, its cultural legacy, as well as controversies. And if you enjoy the show, please remember to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcasting app. This week, we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of Silence of the Lambs. This much-loved psychological horror is, of course, the film that gave us such lines as, "I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti," "It rubs lotion on its skin," and "I'm having an old friend for dinner." Not to mention catapulting the Latin phrase quid pro quo into common usage. Now, before you write in to say that the film was released on Valentine's Day 1991, we're going with the anniversary of the film's release in Japan, June 22nd. Maria, where were you when you first saw the film?
I was in Italy and I watched it on TV. So I watched it dubbed in Italian. And recently I got a little bit curious and I rewatched on YouTube some of the scenes in Italian. And I have to say it's not effective as the original at all.
So Lecter's voice was completely different, like soap opera style?
Not soap opera style, but Lecter's character is so much about Anthony Hopkins' voice. So Clarice. I shouldn't mimic your accent. You start mimicking mine. Did they also dub the Latin? Of course not, because Latin is part of everyday conversation in Italian. Quid pro quo, alea iactes, carpe diem. Should I continue?
No, I'm very impressed.
And what about you, Marcus?
Yeah, I saw the film with my father. It would have been, I guess, in May 91. That's when it came out in Australia. And I remember that we saw the film and then went and had a huge Chinese meal.
Oh my God, how could you eat after that film?
Yeah, that joke was made by my dad many times during the meal. I mean, it gets a bit more extreme because my father was a defense lawyer. And he'd actually worked on a cannibalism case. He'd actually defended someone who had been accused of cooking another human being.
Wow. Australia's own Hannibal Lecter.
Let me just assure the listeners that cannibalism in Australia is as rare as it is everywhere else. I don't know if it was a serial killing. I can't remember that far. But I do remember that it came up in conversation with Dad.
And as a pro, how was the impression of your dad of that movie?
Oh, do you mean like authenticity?
Yeah.
Quite aside from the fact that Dad was looking at it as a professional lawyer and someone who dealt with these kinds of grisly murders, he was also a huge film fan, like a massive film fan. I mean, he took me to see films like The Deer Hunter when I was a kid. So there's a pattern here, isn't there? But with all of that said, he was interested in the performances. He thought that Jodie Foster was fantastic, that Anthony Hopkins was brilliant. And just that the whole film really was a great psychological horror.
As always, this episode is going to be spoiler heavy. We're assuming that everyone listening has already seen the film, but if you're too young to see the film or you have been living under a rock for the past 30 years, we strongly suggest you watch this classic before listening.
Watch it preferably alone and on an empty stomach. Let's begin with a little bit of background about how the film came to be made. In 1988, author Thomas Harris had a hit with the novel The Silence of the Lambs, which would go on to win the Bram Stoker Award for Best Novel. So the book was a sequel to Harris's 1981 novel Red Dragon, which had previously been turned into a movie, Manhunter, by director Michael Mann. That film starred William Peterson as a former FBI profiler brought out of retirement to help investigate a serial killer dubbed the Tooth Fairy.
That film only made $9 million of a $50 million budget. It did so poorly that Dino De Laurentiis passed on the opportunity to produce the sequel himself.
So you watched Manhunter for the first time to prepare for this show, right?
Yeah, and I absolutely loved it. I mean, there's the burnout cop that risked to compromise his private life as in Heat. And also there's something that I found really fascinating, which is the detective is more and more confronted with the serial killer inside himself in order to catch the monster.
Yeah, and it's also full of magnificent 80s hair.
Yeah, it's a trip to the 80s, Miami Vice.
And you are turning into quite the Mann aficionado, aren't you?
Yeah, it's so testosterone charged.
But like all of his films, there's the shots of Peterson looking out into the ocean. It's got all of those sort of Mann moments. And it does make me wonder. So Michael Mann right now, he's in Tokyo, I believe, filming Jake Edelstein's book, Tokyo Vice. It makes me wonder if we're going to see images of a journalist looking out over Tokyo Bay from a very expensive-looking condo.
I'm really looking forward to this because I don't think that most of films get the Japanese criminal minds and the Japanese justice system and the culture in general.
Yeah, I'm very excited to see it. I guess we're getting it, next year?
Yeah, probably.
So with the original producers disinterested, Orion Pictures optioned The Silence of the Lambs with the intention of filming a sequel. Initially, none other than actor Gene Hackman was interested in the project. He hoped to both direct and play the role of Hannibal Lecter in the film. Orion introduced Hackman to playwright Ted Tally with a view to bringing him on as a screenwriter. However, at the time, Tally was yet to have a screenplay produced. But Hackman liked his writing, and Tally signed on to write the treatment. While things were moving ahead at Orion, actor Jodie Foster, hot of her Academy Award-winning performance as a rape victim in The Accused, was interested in playing the lead role of FBI trainee Clarice Starling. Hackman now began to have doubts as to whether he could both direct and play the role of Lecter. In an interview with Deadline magazine, screenwriter Tally said that Hackman thought he might have to drop back to playing Crawford, the FBI boss. On February the 10th, 1989, Tally presented his first draft to Hackman and the producers. Hackman balked at the screenplay's violence. According to Tally, one of Hackman's daughters had read the book and had convinced Hackman not to do it. But the producers at Orion remained committed, and they began looking for another director. They approached Jonathan Demme, best known for 80s comedies Something Wild and Married to the Mob, to direct the picture. Demme had got his start making low-budget Roger Corman films and had also made a name for himself shooting performance films such as Stop Making Sense, the great Stop Making Sense, and Swimming to Cambodia in 1987. Although Demme was an unorthodox choice, he loved the book and signed on. The production now moved into casting. With Hackman off the project, all the roles were up for grabs. Initially, Demme approached Michelle Pfeiffer for the role of Clarice Starling. The director had only recently worked with her on Married to the Mob. She turned down the project. Like Hackman, she was concerned about the level of violence in the picture. Demme then approached Melanie Griffith, Andie MacDowell, Meg Ryan, Kim Basinger, and Gina Davis for the role. They too turned him down, either because of the violent nature of the story or because they were already committed to other projects. Even Emma Thompson was considered.
Can you imagine? It would have been Remains of the Day. So another story is that Brooke Smith auditioned for the role of Starling, and then she found out that her friend Michelle Pfeiffer was in the running. So she is said to have thought, oh great, I'll have to play the fat girl in the hole. And Pfeiffer said, you'll be great at that. Smith said, thanks a lot. Smith would ultimately turn in a brilliant performance as Catherine Martin.
The girl in the hole. Jodie Foster was still lobbying for the role of Clarice Starling, however, Demme couldn't see her in the part.
Yeah, Jonathan Demme tells to Paul Thomas Anderson in an interview that she was really determined to have the role and she wanted to meet him, even though she knew perfectly that he had Michelle Pfeiffer in mind. So she explained why she wanted the role, and she explained that it was story of a young woman that wanted to save the life of another young woman, but in order to do so, she was forced with the overwhelming obstacle of all these men. And at that point, Jonathan Demme thought, what a great idea. I'm going to claim this idea, and still, I'm going to make Meg Ryan play the role.
Demme also struggled to find his Hannibal Lecter. The lengthy list of potential male leads included Robert De Niro, Robert Duvall, Dustin Hoffman, Jack Nicholson, Lou Gossett Jr., Derek Jacobi, John Lithgow, and Jeremy Irons. Again, many of these actors were disinterested or already committed to other projects. John Hurt was considered to be a leading choice, but he was unable to commit due to illness. Even Sean Connery was asked whether he would play Lecter. He turned Demme down, although we can only imagine what Connery's Lecter would have been. Are the lambs still screaming, Clarice?
I'm sorry, but I don't think it would have been terrifying at all.
Demi then approached Anthony Hopkins for the role of Lecter. Later, he would explain that he loved Hopkins as the good doctor in David Lynch's The Elephant Man and thought, what if the good doctor went terribly wrong? At the time, Hopkins had more or less given up on films, preferring to concentrate on theatre. Demi was convinced that Hopkins was right for the role, but the studio wanted a more bankable star. Ultimately, a deal was done. Demi would get his pick of Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter, while the studio would get Oscar-winning Foster as Clarice Starling.
So ultimately, Jonathan Demme got his quid pro quo.
Well, without further ado, let's get into the film's plot. The film opens on trainee FBI agent Clarice Starling, Jodie Foster, running an obstacle course at the Bureau's Academy in Quantico, Virginia. She is summoned to the office of her former teacher, Agent Jack Crawford, Scott Glenn, agent in charge of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. The walls of Crawford's office are lined with newspaper clippings about a serial killer the press has dubbed Buffalo Bill. During Starling's exchange with Crawford, it's quickly established that Foster is an excellent student who one day hopes to join his department. Crawford tells Starling that he has an interesting errand for her. He wants her to interview psychiatrist Dr. Hannibal Lecter, Sir Anthony Hopkins, an imprisoned serial killer who cannibalized his victims. Arriving at the psychiatric prison, Starling is greeted by its chief psychiatrist, Dr. Frederick Chilton, Anthony Held. Chilton tells her Lecter is a monster, pure psychopath. From a research point of view, Lecter is our most prized asset. Chilton makes a clumsy pass at Starling, saying that while they get a lot of detectives visiting the psychiatric prison, I can't remember one as attractive. Starling quickly rejects Chilton's advances and asks if she can approach Lecter's cell alone. At the final checkpoint, an orderly tells Starling that he put out a chair for her. I'll be waiting. You'll do fine. Lecter's cell is at the end of a basement cell block reminiscent of a medieval dungeon. We experience the scene from her point of view. Other inmates shout profanities at her. She arrives to find Lecter standing in wait. Lecter asks Starling to show him her ID card, and immediately he points out that it expires in 1 week. You're not really FBI, are you? Jack Crawford sent a trainee to me. Starling explains that she's there to learn from Lecter. The doctor continues to get inside Starling's head by noting that she uses Evian skin cream. Starling attempts to shift the topic, first to Lecter's drawing of the Duomo in Florence, then to a psych questionnaire. Lecter laughs and notes that Crawford must be very busy indeed hunting Buffalo Bill if he's recruiting help from the student body. He asks Starling why he's called Buffalo Bill. She explains that it's because Bill skins his victims. Lecter tells Starling to pass him the questionnaire. Throughout this sequence, Lecter mocks Starling's accent. He notes that she's so ambitious, but with her good bag and cheap shoes, she looks like a rube, a well-scrubbed, hustling rube with a little taste. Unnerved, Starling tries to regain control of the situation and asks Lecter to point his high-powered perception at himself. Lecter tells her that a census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti. He finishes, fly back to school, little Starling. Their meeting seemingly over, Starling leaves Lecter. As she does, the man in the next cell flings semen at her, hitting Starling in the face. Lecter yells out at her to return, apologizes for what has just happened, and tells Starling to go to Baltimore and see Miss Moffat, an old patient of his. We cut to outside the prison, where Starling pauses, badly shaken. The scene blurs, and we see a young Starling, in flashback, greeting her father, a town marshal. When we return to the asylum car park, Starling is crying next to her car, a crappy old Pinto.
End scene.
So let's begin by looking at each of the characters. Rewatching the film after several years, I was really struck by how layered the character of Clarice Starling is.
And even after 30 years, is still celebrated as a feminist heroine. And what I find interesting is that many interpretations highlight the fact that compared to Thomas Harris' novel, the character of Clarice Starling is portrayed as weaker in multiple ways. To begin with, the physical strength and the appearance. So, for example, there's the opening scene that's not in the book, which is the training scene. And the surroundings, the lonely woods, immediately evoke a horror trope. So we know that we found out in a few minutes that it's a training scene, but it could be a girl escaping a serial killer. It could be a final girl. Also, her appearance. There's another scene that is pivotal in showing how the character is smaller, is petite in comparison to the other people in the FBI, which are predominantly male, and it's the elevator scene when she rushes to an elevator and she's surrounded by men in a red shirt.
Yeah, the FBI basketball team.
Yeah, and they're all towering over her, and she is this sweaty tracksuit.
Yeah, and of course it was kind of reversed for Lost in Translation.
Oh yeah, exactly. So this is my life here. the FBI scene is my life in Italy, and so anyway, for example, writer Joan G. Kotker has argued that the film undermines Sterling's competence from the start. I wouldn't go as far as saying that. I would say that the film tries to show as much as possible how the world around Clarice is denying any kind of validation to her. So she is an A student, but the patriarchy clearly resents her being competent and good. So she will always get an A minus.
Yeah, exactly. And the person that gave her an A minus is her, I guess, mentor, Jack Crawford. And Crawford's like this father figure. We see that he's someone who takes a particular interest in the career of Clarice Starling. He sends her to interview Lecter, an imprisoned criminal who trades clues for painful memories. Straight away, we know that Crawford is a morally dubious person. He's somebody who is willing to make sacrifices of others in order to get what he wants.
He is someone that thinks himself as a good guy, and he
Exactly.
ends up being the bad guy. He's always examining Clarice, and he's always not at all generous with validation or appreciation. He really reminds me of my professor in university. He used to have a thesis for men and thesis for women. So,
Really?
Yeah, and when I wanted to graduate with him, he wanted to give me the girl thesis, and I fought to have a thesis that were for the quote-unquote boys. And he was dismissive, and he was playing this, I think you're a good student, but then soon after diminishing my value. So I really felt so...
I hope he's listening. Crawford is very much part of the institution, and I think not only are we seeing Crawford the man as this sort of chauvinist character, but also Crawford represents the FBI, and this is actually articulated very well by Starling later on, where she says, men look at you to know how to respond to me. And so if you dismiss me, then that's the way that the rest of the men are going to do it.
You're going to set an example. Exactly.
Yeah, so and this is how you end up with an institution where everybody has the same either chauvinist attitudes or racist attitudes or whatever. And what did you make of Chilton's character?
Oh, Chilton is this slimy, terrible person that it's really the epitome of the Me Too predator. So he is someone who values a woman only as an object of desire. So he doesn't have enough occasion to say how Clarice was chosen because she's a young, pretty woman. And also when she rejects him, then his attitude towards her changes completely. When he says, let's make it quick, and then he blames her for wanting to be alone with Lecter and saying, you should have told me before so I wouldn't waste my time. So it's also all the typical behavior.
If we're digging deep on the characters, I think it's very interesting that you have Chilton, who is just this narcissist, kind of familiar to anyone who's lived through the last 4 years, who is just absolutely slimy, as you said. Then you have someone who can hide it, who also is part of an institution and has the respect of others, Crawford. And then you have someone who actually treats Starling with a certain degree of respect. And ironically, of course, that's Lecter.
Yeah, I think that's the main message, is that the real monster is someone like Chilton, and someone that the world considers, of course, for reasons, a monster, is the only one that treats Clarice with respect, and he's probably the only one who actually teaches her something.
So we should talk here a little bit about Dr. Hannibal Lecter. The first time that I saw Sir Anthony Hopkins playing this role, I just found the performance was so magnetic that I almost didn't catch what he was saying. You're just mesmerized. I mean, there is a real sort of staring down the barrel of the camera, looking at you, the audience, and reading your thoughts. I do recall thinking, I don't really know what's happening in this scene plot-wise because I'm just so engaged with the aspect, the way that this character is looking at me.
There's so many levels. Like, first of all, there's the voice that apparently is a mixture of Truman Capote and Katharine Hepburn, according to Sir Hopkins.
To Hopkins.
Yes. And the other thing is the gaze. The quality of the gaze changes in the first encounter. So him and Clarice meet 4 times. And the first time is really, if you pass me the image, a hungry gaze, because Clarice is the world outside, is this ambitious, young, fresh person that is bringing the outside world to him. So it's all about curiosity. It's all about wanting to live a life through her.
Well, yeah, you just brought up another interesting point, which is that she represents the outside world.
Yeah, absolutely. And other thing is the timing that he carves for himself. So the world, and especially in the hunt of the serial killer, there's not much time. But Hannibal Lecter would create a time space, a time capsule that is totally different.
Here we have to recognize the contribution of the editor to just how well paced that opening dialogue in particular is. I mean, it's just brilliant. It's hard to imagine anyone other than Hopkins playing the role, isn't it? I mean, with retrospect.
With retrospect. Even though I must say that in Manhunter, Brian Cox does a great job.
I mentioned this 2 episodes ago on the episode about unfinished films, that Brian Cox really is outstanding in the original film, in Manhunter. But obviously they were looking for something quite different. And they do bring different things to the character.
And I think we cannot think of Hannibal Lecter without Anthony Hopkins ever again. So kudos to the courage of Mads Mikkelsen to take up the part and create something interesting, different but interesting.
One of the things that I think Hopkins brings to this is a kind of sense of impro. Like, he's adding a layer on top of the performance. So you've got the scripted performance and some great lines from Ted Tally. But then on top of that, you have Hopkins doing the imitation of Starling's accent. And that was something that I think was done on the day, and I don't believe that Jodie Foster knew that that was coming. So he's mimicking her accent. And then there's also the slimy sound effects. There's a number of ways in which Hopkins seems to be just toying with this new thing that's appeared in front of him, the representative of the outside world. It's really a pleasure to just watch the way that he plays that character. So he's an absolute presence in this film.
And also we have to note the fact that after that, even though it's Anthony Hopkins himself playing Hannibal Lecter, the Hannibal Lecter after Silence of the Lamb, Hannibal and Red Dragon are kind of a caricature of the same character, sadly.
Yeah, but he would never get the same kind of character again. I mean, what you see in the sequel is nothing like the Hannibal Lecter that we get in Demi's movie. A couple of other things I wanted to bring up before we kind of continue. Have you ever heard about how Anthony Hopkins learns his lines?
No.
Hopkins has this thing, and I remember hearing about it years ago when he was talking about his theatre work. What he does is he makes a mark for every time he reads the script. So he goes through the script and he goes through the script, and he reads it something like 250 times. It makes 250 individual marks to show that he's done it. And once he's done it 250 times, he says, I know it. So this is his process. His process is learn it. 250 times he reads through it. And then, okay, now I know my lines.
Now, he says that when asked how he prepared for the role, that he doesn't research much. It's like all his source is in the script. So he will really try to go through it thoroughly. And also things that he added to the character was the non-blinking thing. So apparently he knew a friend in the circle of friends that didn't blink. And it was kind of a disturbing person to talk to. So his blinking is only to underline some moments.
Well, there you go, listeners. A little tip for your next Zoom meeting. I wanted to ask you also about the sound design. Did you notice something as Clarice is being led by Chilton down into the dungeon?
They're almost like machines that keep you alive kind of sound. It's
It's like
very
an artificial
clinical,
respirator,
yeah.
something like that. Yeah, what I think has happened here, and I haven't been able to research this, I feel like Howard Shore, who incidentally you will remember from our last episode on After Hours,
So different.
totally different
soundtrack.
here. But Howard Shore here, it's this kind of increasing soundscape as Clarice descends into C. Lecter, and as the tension rises, there's a kind of a background hum of different, almost mechanical, as you said, like artificial respirator and other things. But you can hear this kind of humming, this building, mechanical humming building throughout that journey down into the underworld, so to speak. I find that really effective, and I didn't notice it for the first several times that I saw it, and it's only now 30 years later watching it again with the sound cranked up on my nice speakers that I can actually hear it. But it really does tell you as an audience, be worried, be fearful. We're going places we should not be going.
You could almost feel the chills with the sound. It's almost like you were in the depths of a well or something. So through sound, you can feel temperature.
One other thing I'd like to quickly mention before we move on. There's that great lighting. As Chilton's leading Clarice down into this cell area to see Lecter, they pass from this daylight and into this red light, which is obviously like the final checkpoint. And just kind of, we had this conversation on After Hours, the descent into hell. Here, descent into the underworld. It's really overt with the red light bouncing off Chilton's face and Clarice passing from what is essentially daylight down into this kind of underworld. I thought that was really impressive and pretty bold, because it could be kind of trashy. If you suddenly like, hey, yeah, let's put up some Par 64s and blast a whole lot of red light at somebody, it could look a little bit like a 1980s rock video. But I think it's very effective.
Very organic.
Yep. All right, without further ado, let's move on to part 2 of Silence of the Lambs. So we left Starling outside the psychiatric prison, crying next to her crappy Ford Pinto. At this point, there's a great scripted transition to the firing range back at Quantico. After Clarice vents some frustration, we next see her in the library researching Lecter. During this time, she receives a call from the guru, Crawford, asking about her report and the Baltimore lead. Crawford also tells Starling that Miggs, the man in the cell next to Lecter, was found dead, having swallowed his own tongue. Starling follows up Lecter's Baltimore lead and discovers that a Ms. Moffat rented space at a self-storage facility, Your Self Storage. She and the elderly owner go to the storage lot, and the owner explains that Moffat had paid 10 years in advance and that the place hadn't been touched. When Starling tries to gain entry through a roller door, she finds it stuck. The elderly man says his driver detests physical labor. I love that line. It's completely out of the blue. And he himself is too old. Maybe they should return with the man's son the next day. Starling responds that she can handle it, goes to her car, returns with a jack. She's able to raise the door enough to get inside, but she cuts herself as she goes in. The storage room is full of taxidermied animals and mannequins with limbs missing. In my experience, never a good sign. Searching the room for clues, Starling comes across the decapitated head in a jar of what must be formalin. Starling immediately returns to the psychiatric prison to question Lecter again about the severed head. She knows he rented the storage facility because of his anagram. Ms. Hector Moffat rearranged the letters and you get Miss the Rest of Me. Lecter claims to have knowledge of the Buffalo Bill case, but only if he can see the case file. He tells Starling that the severed head is Buffalo Bill's first victim, a former patient, and that he, Lecter, merely put it in storage for safekeeping. Lecter says that he was a kind of experiment, a fledgling killer's first effort at transformation. Starling presses him on this point, but first Lecter says he wants a room with a view. Clarice asks, "What do you mean by fledgling killer? Are you saying that he's killed again?" Lecter says he wants to see the case evidence and that he'll help Starling catch Buffalo Bill. Starling asks, "You know who killed him, don't you?" And Lecter replies, "All good things come to those who wait." Here the action cuts to the inside of a car, and a young woman, Catherine Martin, played by Brooke Smith, is singing Tom Petty's American Girl along to the radio. A man with night vision goggles lies in wait for her outside her apartment. When the girl pulls up to her home, the man with one arm in a cast appears, struggling to lift a sofa into the back of his van. Catherine offers to help, and when she does, the man encourages her to get inside the van to help him lift it. Once she's inside, he asks, "Are you about a size 14?" before knocking her unconscious. The man looks about the street, then closes the van's doors. We briefly see him cutting her dress with scissors before the scene ends. Back at the academy, Starling is told to pack her bags and join Crawford on the Buffalo Bill investigation. A young woman has been found in a river in West Virginia. On the flight, Crawford outlines Bill's MO. He keeps the victims alive for 3 days, then he shoots them, skins them, and dumps them. The investigators then drive to a funeral home. Sitting in the front with Starling in the back, Crawford asks the young trainee to describe what she sees. Starling gives her analysis, saying that the killer has real taste for it now. Crawford turns and says, "Not bad, Starling." The young trainee then asks Crawford to confirm her suspicions, that he sent her to Lecter to get the inmate to talk about Buffalo Bill. When the older FBI man says nothing, she adds, "If that were the case, I just wish I were in on it." Crawford replies, "If I'd sent you in there with an agenda, Lecter would have known immediately."
So typical of Crawford. I mean, saying not bad. If it was a male trainee, I'm sure that it would be much more generous in his validation.
Yeah, and he might have actually looked at her.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's very pointed, isn't it? They arrive at the Grigg funeral home. Inside, they're ushered into a room full of unusually large police officers and introduced to Sheriff Perkins and his men. Perkins seems hostile to their presence. Crawford steps forward and, nodding in Starling's direction, says, "Sheriff, this kind of sex crime has certain aspects I'd rather discuss in private." The sheriff and Crawford leave the room, and Starling is left alone with the other officers who appear to be staring at her. And here, Demi and Fujimoto do a great job of reinforcing the point of the scene, with Starling's point of view as the sheriff's officers look at her, then at one another.
Looking at her like they never saw a girl in their life.
Absolutely.
It seems like a scene in a village in 1950 southern Italy.
Starling leaves in the direction of organ music playing in an adjacent room. It's a funeral. As she approaches the corpse, she recognizes her father lying in the open coffin. In a flashback, we see a young Clarice kissing her father's forehead, and we're abruptly brought back to the present. Starling is called into an autopsy room. The house where they shot this, incidentally, was formerly a real funeral home. Starling takes the initiative and asks for all the sheriff's men to leave the room. "Go on now." In a seemingly realistic and horrible scene, Buffalo Bill's latest victim is examined. The skin is cut from her back. Noticing that something is stuck in the dead woman's throat, Starling looks on as a moth's cocoon is pulled from the dead woman's trachea. On the way back to the airport, Crawford apologizes for telling the sheriff that they shouldn't talk in front of a woman. Starling responds, "It matters, Mr. Crawford. The cops look at you on how to react," and he promptly falls asleep. Back in DC, Starling visits what I assume to be the National History Museum. She discovers that the moth is rare and must have been imported into the United States. During this scene, one of the entomologists hits on Starling, and once again she has to deflect a man's attentions.
Oh, I really love that scene. I mean, how bizarre is that scene of these two entomologists playing chess with bugs?
Yeah.
And this incredible actor, Paul Lazar, that's been in all of Jonathan Demme's films, playing Dr. Pilcher. And actually in the book, Clarice goes on a date at the end with Dr. Pilcher. So there's a love story that's completely...
Really? I
yes.
don't remember that.
So there's this is a part that's completely removed in the film. So another point is that Clarice is totally desexualized in the film version.
Another interesting anecdote from Demi is talking about the influence of Roger Corman on his work. And he says that Corman's boilerplate approach to a film is you must cast interesting small parts. So when you have a a kind of a bit part. Make sure you use somebody who's memorable, someone who's interesting.
Oh, and absolutely, I think Jonathan Demme is putting into practice because every single small part is interesting. Dr. Lang, the owner of the storage room, is someone that we see in Something Wild as the client of the diner place.
Nice pickup. I didn't get that one.
And of course, the chauffeur of Dr. Lan, the one that says he doesn't do physical
He doesn't like physical labor.
And there's a close-up of him. Every person that has even doesn't have a line or have one line is someone that you probably have met at some point in your life and is so interesting. Yes.
The connection having been made with Buffalo Bill, the film now cuts to the house where Catherine Martin is being held prisoner. The serial killer is sewing skin, while in the background we can hear Catherine screaming. Starling and another trainee are walking the halls of the academy when they stop to watch a TV news broadcast. The 25-year-old daughter of a US senator has been kidnapped. The senator appeals to the kidnapper. Catherine is gentle and kind. You have the power. You are in charge. Show you are merciful. My daughter is Catherine. The senator is trying to humanize her daughter. Starling now returns to the asylum where she proposes a deal to Lecter. Help with the return of Catherine Martin, and he will be moved to a new prison and be given the opportunity once a year to spend time walking freely on an island, although still under strict supervision. She passes Lecter the senator's offer, as well as the case file. Lecter counters, if I help you, it will be turns with us about yourself, quid pro quo. She agrees. He begins the interrogation. What is your worst memory of childhood? And she responds, the death of my father. He was a town marshal who surprised 2 burglars. They shot him. She reminds him of their deal. Lecter asks if the kidnapped girl is large. They all were, explains Starling. Clarice goes on to explain about the moth in the dead girl's throat, just like the one found in the head taken from the storage unit. Lecter says that the moth represents change, and that Billy wants to change too. There's no correlation between transsexualism and violence, Starling begins. Transsexuals are very passive. Lecter agrees. You are so close to the way you're going to catch him. The doctor returns to his interrogation of Clarice. After you were orphaned, what happened next? Starling explains that she went to live with her mother's cousin on a ranch, sheep and horses. She ran away after 2 months. The doctor presses her from his cell. Why? Did the rancher make you do things? No, Starling repeats. Quid pro quo. Lecter says that Billy is not a real transsexual, but he's tried to be a lot of things, I expect. Clarice asks what Lecter means about being close to the way she'll find Buffalo Bill. Lecter explains that there are 3 major centers for gender reassignment surgery, and that Bill would have been rejected by one or more of them. At the end of the scene, we see Chilton in extreme close-up listening in on their conversation. The scene cuts to Buffalo Bill, who is keeping Martin in a dungeon-like well. It rubs lotion on its skin. He holds a small dog while he shouts down to the senator's daughter. In the torchlight, Martin sees the blood and fingernails of Bill's previous victims on the walls of her prison and screams. Bill mocks her screaming. Back at the asylum, Lecter is standing in a cage. Chilton says, there never was a deal with Senator Martin, but there is now. I designed it. During this, the camera closes in on a nearby table and a pen. Chilton gloats over his control of the situation. Who is Buffalo Bill? He asks. Lecter says that his first name is Louis and that he has a few conditions of his own. In a short expository scene, none other than Roger Corman, playing the head of the FBI, calls Crawford about the deal made with Lecter. Corman's character explains that the senator is as mad as hell and that another agent will be taking over in Memphis, where Lecter is being moved. In Memphis, Lecter appears in a straitjacket and wearing an ominous face mask. Demi alum Charles Napier asks Chilton to sign for the transfer of Lecter. Chilton has to borrow a pen, as his own is missing. Senator Martin walks toward Lecter, asking for information that will help save her daughter. Mann says she will assist the doctor if he'll help find Catherine. Lecter quickly gives up the name of the suspect, Louis Friend, but then asks, tell me, Senator, did you nurse Catherine yourself? Martin turns away in disgust. Take this thing back to Baltimore, she says, and it's one of my very favorite lines. Before he's led away, Lecter throws in a few more clues. 5'10", strongly built, about 180 pounds, about 35 now.
Oh, and one more thing, Senator. I love your suit.
Clarice goes to visit Lecter in his Memphis holding cell. Now, it's a bit of a mystery exactly why Lecter is being held on the third floor of Memphis Town Hall, but Starling returns Lecter's drawings just until he gets his view. Lecter responds with, "People will say we're in love."
This line is taken from the musical Oklahoma.
Oh, really?
Yes.
He reminds her that the clock is ticking for the senator's daughter. Starling reveals that she has worked out Lecter's anagram. Louis Friend forms iron sulfide or fool's gold. Lecter says that everything Starling needs to solve the case is in the files. What is his nature? What is it that this man does? Starling tries several times before Lecter himself answers the question. He covets. We covet what we see every day. Don't you feel eyes moving over your body every day? Increasingly anxious with the time all of this is taking, Starling pleads with Lecter to explain what he means, but Lecter returns to the quid pro quo arrangement. In a series of extreme close-up images, Lecter demands to know what happened on the ranch and why exactly the young Clarice ran away. She explains that she woke up one morning to the sound of lambs screaming. She says that she opened the pen for the lambs to escape, but they just stood there. She then tried to rescue just one and run away, but it was too heavy to carry. She only got a few miles before the sheriff picked her up. When Lecter asks what ultimately happened to the lamb, Clarice reveals that she couldn't save it and the rancher had it killed. "You still wake up sometimes and hear the screaming of the lambs?" asks Lecter. "Yes," says Clarice, "and if you think you could save poor Catherine, you could make it stop?" At that moment, Chilton and the police detail burst into the room and lead Starling away. She pleads with Lecter to reveal Bill's real name. Lecter reminds her that she left the case file, and Starling breaks free to run back to Lecter. The scene ends with Lecter passing the file through the bars to his cage. As he does so, his finger brushes hers.
Interesting enough, people always compare this scene to Michelangelo's creation of Adam.
You know what? I never made that connection.
So it's a moment where the science is passed or the goodness is passed. I don't know. The goodness from Clarice to Hannibal. So
He's about to murder a whole lot of people. There's no goodness being passed here. Okay, so we cut back to Lecter's Memphis cage. A tape recorder is playing classical piano. Elsewhere on the table, there's now a new drawing of Starling holding a lamb, and it's pretty kitsch. The camera moves to reveal Lecter seated on a toilet behind a screen. The guards arrive, complaining that Lecter demanded a second dinner. Lamb chops, extra rare. Behind the screen, Lecter spits out part of Chilton's stolen pen. Lecter appears from behind the screen and the guards cuff him to the bars of his cage while they carry his food. Unseen by the guards, Lecter unlocks his handcuffs. As Lieutenant Boyle, Charles Napier, clears Lecter's drawings to put down the tray, Lecter handcuffs the unlucky policeman to the side of the cage. Lecter then bites the other policeman, Officer Pembry, Alex Coleman, in the face, then sprays mace in his eyes. Finally, Lecter takes the fallen man's baton and with a conductor-like flourish beats Boyle to death.
quite a terrifying scene. The contrast between the Goldberg variation and the the brutality of the blood splashing.
Down on the ground, the other members of the police detail see the elevator ascending to the top of the building. They then hear shots fired. They look on in shock as the elevator indicator shows it returning to the third floor. The lead officer calls for a SWAT team and an ambulance. The police file up the stairs, guns drawn. When they enter the chamber housing Lecter's cage, they're shocked to discover a gruesome tableau. Officer Pembry dead on the floor and Boyle strung up to the side of the cage, disemboweled. Lecter is, of course, missing. And just before we go on, did you realize that Charles Napier is the leader of the Good Old Boys in Blues Brothers?
Is he? Well, anyway, Charles Napier has some amazing parts in all Jonathan movies.
Yeah,
films.
he's in all of Demi's films, and he's also the chef in Something
the chef
Wild,
in
who
Something
comes out
Wild.
just looking for a fight.
Yeah.
The officers quickly realize that Officer Pembry is still breathing, and they try to keep the victim calm while they wait for an ambulance. The SWAT team, including a shotgun-toting, gum-chewing Chris Isaac, arrive downstairs moments before the police bring the injured Pembry down in the elevator. As they do so, an ambulance man notices drops of blood falling from the ceiling of the elevator and onto the gurney. They rush Pembry out of the elevator and onto a nearby ambulance. The police officers, meanwhile, open the doors at a higher floor and see a body lying face down on top of the elevator. They shoot the leg, but the body doesn't move. The SWAT officers then open the ceiling hatch, ready to fire on Lecter. The scene cuts to the ambulance with the injured Pembry. While the physician talks on the radio, the bloodied man removes his oxygen mask and then the skin from his face. Lecter has been masquerading as the fallen police officer.
One of the scenes that struck me rewatching the movie was that scene when they discover Pembry, what they think is Pembry, still alive. And there's this young officer, and he is like,
What do I do? Yeah.
Yeah, what do I do? And I should talk to him. So what do I say? And you see someone that's probably never been into this situation and this dramatic. So you see all the vulnerability of the guy. And
Well, it's like something out of a war movie, isn't it? It's like
exactly.
the fallen soldier and the comrades have to come up and say, it's okay, you look great, you're going to be fine.
Yeah.
And it's obviously complete BS, right?
And at the same time, as an audience, you're put in a very awkward situation because maybe the first screening you don't know, but once you rewatch it, you know that this is not Pembry and this is Hannibal Lecter. So it's very uncomfortable to watch it.
The pleasure of the thriller, right?
It's very, very uncomfortable to watch it.
There's another dramatic cut as Adelia, Casey Lemons, a fellow FBI trainee, runs down the hall to tell Starling that Lecter has escaped and that the ambulance men have been found murdered. Adelia warns Clarice that Lecter may come after her. No, says Starling. He would consider that rude. Starling returns to the case file. He said everything we need to catch him is in this file. Now, there are a number of short scenes here intercut. At the house where Bill is holding Martin, the killer is shown sewing together human skin. Adelia comes across a map in the case file with a note from Lecter. Clarice, doesn't this random scattering of sites seem to be desperately random? Asked Lecter. The two trainees return to the first victim, who was weighted down so that she was found later than the others. First girl taken, the third found. Why? This scene between Clarice and Adelia is particularly intimate thanks to Demi's trademark matching POV shots. What does this guy do? He covets. How do we covet? Adelia answers, we covet what we see every day. They realize that Bill knew his first victim. Starling now travels to Belvedere, Ohio, to visit the father of the first victim and search for more clues. In the dead girl's bedroom, Starling finds some revealing selfies hidden in the lining of a music box. In the next room, she finds a dressmaker's mannequin. Opening the wardrobe, she finds a dress. Pinned to it are two diamond shapes, just like those of the skin removed from the victims. Clarice immediately calls Crawford to report that Bill is making a dress of human skin. Crawford tells Starling that he already has the identity of the killer and his team is on the way to pick him up in Chicago. Johns Hopkins provided a list of names which was cross-referenced with those of known offenders. One, Jamie Gum. Lecter gave the right description, but lied about the name. Crawford adds, 2 years ago, Customs picked up a crate of live caterpillars from South America with Gum's name on it. Starling wants to come to Chicago, but Crawford tells her to stay and see if she can link Gum to the first victim. Crawford tells Starling that they would never have found Gum without her help. He adds, we'll never forget, least of all me. Here, the action cuts to the pit, where Catherine Martin is being held. She is making a trap out of string to capture Bill's dog, Precious. In a montage to cue Lazarus's Goodbye Horses, Bill puts on makeup and dances naked in front of a mirror. Meanwhile, Catherine tries to lure Precious into her bone tied to a bucket trap.
Jonathan Demme really loves this song. He used it also in Married to the Mob.
He used it in 2 films. I don't remember it in that.
There's a scene where Angela, the protagonist played by Michelle Pfeiffer, and the guy that she doesn't know is a cop, Matthew Modine.
Yep.
Comes back from partying, and they talk when the song is playing.
On the ground in Chicago, Crawford and his team prepare to raid Gum's house. Back in Ohio, Starling interviews one of the first victim's friends. If she had a guy, she would have told me. Sewing was her life. The friend tells Starling that they used to do alterations for old Mrs. Lipman. Starling asks for the old woman's address. The cross-cutting now begins to gather pace. Back in Illinois, Crawford and his team surround a single-story house. Buffalo Bill takes a bug from a tray and removes some kind of... Truth be told, I don't know what he removes. The scene continues to move between inside and outside Gum's house, and the police prepare to move in. In the middle of all of this, Bill hears his dog Precious whimpering. Precious? Catherine shouts, "Down here, you sack of shit." She has Bill's dog. He demands she put it in the bucket. "She's in a lot of pain, mister. She needs a vet." "Don't you hurt my dog. Don't you make me hurt your dog."
Apparently, the dog trainer was a little bit concerned because Brooke Smith was holding the dog too tight. By the way, the dog real name is Darla. So she was holding Darla too tight. And she could see Ted Levine looking at her, but she also could see the dog trainer looking at her like, "You're hurting my dog."
I shouldn't really laugh at that, but... At this moment, the doorbell rings. Bill goes to answer, placing his gun just out of sight in the kitchen. When he opens it, instead of being confronted by Crawford's men, it's Starling at the door. She tells Bill she's looking for Mrs. Lipman's family. In Chicago, Crawford's men are seen breaking into an empty house. Bill tells Starling that the Lipmans don't live there anymore. Starling asks Bill if he knew the first victim. He says he read about the death of the big fat girl and goes inside on the pretext of getting the name card for Mrs. Lipman's son. Only now do we briefly see the outside of the house, beside a train line, some distance away from the neighbors. He asks, "Are you close to catching someone, do you think?" Starling is seen to be growing suspicious of Bill. When she sees a moth land on some spools of thread, she unbuttons the holster of her service weapon. Bill offers Starling the name card, and she asks to use his telephone. She shouts "freeze" and pulls her gun. Bill runs back into the maze of rooms which make up the house. Starling nervously follows him downstairs. Clarice can now hear Martin shouting and the dog barking. She passes what appears to be Bill's suit of human skin. She makes her way into the dungeon and shouts down to Catherine that she's with the police and she'll get her out soon. Martin screams back, "Don't you leave me here, you bitch." Opening a door to what appears to be a bathroom, Starling finds the putrefying remains of a body in a bathtub. Maybe Mrs. Lipman. At that moment, the power goes out, and we see Starling illuminated through the green glow of Bill's night vision goggles. Terrified, Clarice tries to make her way through the darkness. Bill slowly approaches her and raises his gun. As he cocks it, Starling spins around and shoots him. As shots ring out, one smashes a window and the room fills with light. Bill dies in front of Starling, still wearing the night vision goggles. The scene ends with the camera dolling in on a newspaper clipping pinned to a wall. The headline reads, "Bill Skins 5th." The film's final scene takes place at an FBI graduation ceremony as Starling receives her FBI badge. Crawford looks on approvingly from the wings. At the reception, he tells her that he's leaving. They shake hands and Crawford tells Clarice that her father would have been proud today. Starling takes a phone call from an adjoining hallway. Lecter's voice purrs on the other end of the line. "Have the lambs stopped screaming?" He reassures Clarice that he has no plans to call on her. "The world is much more interesting with you in it." He finishes, "I do wish we could chat longer, but I'm having an old friend for dinner." The film ends with Lecter stalking Dr. Chilton down a Bahamian street.
What an ending.
It is a great ending.
It's a great ending. And goes through all the credits. So
right, the credits really run the whole way through and we just watch
and we just watch Lecter disappearing to be just one of the many, many people. It's really kind of a harrowing image and thought. But you know that the original ending in the script was not like this.
No.
The ending that Ted Talley thought of was of Hannibal Lecter stalking Clarice. So in the phone call, he would talk about the way she was dressed.
And so who changed that? Was that Talley's decision or was that Demi's decision?
So Demi was not okay with that. So Jonathan Demme was pretty much okay with everything that Ted Talley came up with up until that point. But for the ending, he didn't want that. He didn't think that Hannibal Lecter would come after Clarice.
And I guess that he wanted to continue Clarice's story.
I think so. And Ted Tully came up with the idea, probably relating to the fact that Clarice suggested an exotic island as a possible recollocation of Hannibal Lecter. So the ending in the Bahamas. And since Jonathan Demme has friendship with Thomas Harris, he went for consultation. Mm-hmm. And Thomas Harris was like, personally, I imagine Hannibal Lecter walking in a fashionable street in Zurich, window shopping for watches. But if you have to make it the Bahamas, at least please don't make Hannibal Lecter sweat.
Well, even after 30 years, this film stands the test of time. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Even though it kind of creates its own cliche, the nice Chianti and having a friend for dinner.
The
fava beans. I rewatched it recently for the podcast, and it really retains a freshness. There's depth in the characters.
Well,
a humanity.
There's a humanity that I think Demme brings to all of his projects, and this is very much a director's film in that way. But the writing itself, you could look at it as saying that the source novel is kind of pulpy. We have a man in a dungeon giving tips to a young woman, a trainee, and all of those things in themselves it's a little bit trashy, I guess, but what Tully does with the script is phenomenal. I mean, he really takes the source material and transforms it into something far more interesting. But as you said, the film resists cliche. Yes, it does make them. we all know the parodies. We all know those scenes of various characters, whether it's South Park, The Simpsons, or whatever. People wearing face masks and talking about fava beans and Chianti. But the approach to the material, it feels more like a documentary a lot of the time, despite the fact that it still uses a lot of Hitchcockian situations, and definitely it has that approach of building tension, whether it's pushing the camera in on a particularly important object, such as a pen. When Chilton loses his pen, camera pushes in. When we're looking around Crawford's office at the beginning, and we see from the point of view of Clarice the different pieces of important evidence put up on the wall to give you the exposition. I mean, all of that has been done a million times.
It's classical cinema.
But at the same time, the way that Demme approaches this material and the incredible performances, it just doesn't feel stale for 1 minute. Even now, it doesn't feel stale.
Hannibal Lecter is a cocktail of different horrific characters like Dracula or the unstoppable slasher serial killer. And he kind of blends all of this element, but the result is totally original and totally unseen up at this point.
Why is Clarice so relatable?
Well, I think that the construction of this character is really interesting, especially in the context of the female detective at that time. I'm thinking of films like Blue Steel or Via Warshawski with Kathleen Turner. The problem about that time between the 80s and 90s was to create a female character that was strong, but at the same time non-threatening. What I see in Clarice is that she is not afraid to show her fears. She makes her vulnerability her strength. And this is something that immediately makes her relatable and makes her lovable to us.
It's got me thinking about classic cinema and film noir, because of course the femme fatale is the strong woman, yet she's out to get you, men.
No, the femme fatale is someone that disguises herself as a little lamb. She's the woman that's married to a brutal man. She wants to be saved. And then she is the one that has all the strings to the puppet.
Pulling all the strings, yes.
All the string. So I think this is reversed because we wanted to have someone that has elements of the final girl because she is alone with a serial killer. And even though she is FBI, so she's close to becoming a special agent, most of her tactics, most of her action comes non-supervised by the FBI.
From within.
Yeah. And even though Crawford said, we've got it.
Yeah,
so
don't
worry about it. She continues to do her investigation. So she knows, she has this hunch.
Isn't that a great scene, though? I mean, really a wonderful bit of writing that Crawford says, look, we've got it. You just stay there. You just keep, tidy up.
Yes.
You just clean up all of the stuff that you need to do.
Which is the basis, which is the core of what happens to a lot of women that work in a male-dominated place.
And this really does bring us back to Jodie Foster's conversation with Demi,
Yeah.
where Foster says, look, I see this film as being about a young woman who is part of the system and like fighting against the system. And that's exactly what Demi went with, you know, even though he wasn't going to cast her.
Yeah, it was ultimately, he was going to be the Crawford of the situation, but thankfully he was not.
So the feminist aspect of the film, I think it's very easy to see. We should really address the representation of a trans character in the film.
Some of the things are undeniable, and this is the point I think that we can feel that 30 years passed. There are some elements like the linkage of cross-dressing and psychosis or murder that's been done by films like Psycho or Dress to Kill. So those elements are there. And on the one side, both Harris and both Demi and Ted Tully in the film, they deny that the character is transsexual. But the way it's denied, because Hannibal Lecter says that Buffalo Bill is not transsexual.
It's in the dialogue, yes.
Yes, but the problem and the what really shows that the film is of a different era is that identities should not be put from someone else. So in that sense, the view on transgender is a little bit totalitarian in this movie.
Yeah, I'm glad you read it that way because that was the way that I saw it watching it for the first time in many years this week. It's the way that the character is constructed by others.
Yeah.
And how is it that others can judge what a person's gender sexuality is? That I can totally understand as being controversial. So Demi, in an interview many years later, I think it was for the 25th anniversary, said that the film was portraying a character, as Lecter said, is not trans but thinks that they're trans. So this is still a problematic question because it's something that, as you described, as totalitarian. It's other people describing the character. But Demi offers the example of Anthony Perkins in Psycho and says, look, we don't remember the character as trans. It's more a character who is dressing up as his mother.
I think what provoked the argument was what we could say, like the superficial linkage of serial killing and sexual orientation, which is there. And also what was probably more troublesome was the contrast between the script trying to dodge this and denying the transsexual nature of the character, and on the other side, the visuals, which lingering with close-ups, with extreme close-ups to what in popular culture are strong gay stereotypes, like the makeup, the white poodle. So literally inviting the audience to read the character as queer.
Yeah, and the fact is that this film was phenomenally successful.
Exactly.
And one of the things you have to keep in mind with a film of this cultural power is that people are going to see it and see it in large numbers, and they're going to equate. I mean, whether you like it or not, and whether this is Demi's intention, or I'm guessing it wasn't, but the fact is that people are going to associate violence with this trans character keeping a woman in a dungeon.
I would say, as Clarice says to Crawford, sir, it matters. You know, representation matters.
Yeah. In making this film, whether 1 million people saw it or millions and millions of people saw it, it does establish a link between violence and trans characters.
Everybody's going to remember that dance with the kimono, yeah.
Well, the visuals really do tell us a lot about Bill. And there are a number of things in the production design which I think are particularly interesting that are kind of a little unexpected. For example, the Nazi bedspread that Bill has. Also, on the wall of Bill's apartment, there's also a poster saying, "America, open your eyes." Who is Bill? He's not just the serial killer, and he's not just a character who's trying to question his identity. It seems to me that Bill certainly has far-right sympathies as well. Maria, you noticed some other Easter eggs elsewhere in the film.
Yeah, I think the work that production designer Christy Zia does on this film is really outstanding. Beginning with the idea of making the cell for Hannibal Lecter of plexiglass. In this way, making it possible for Clarice and Hannibal to be really close. Also, some quite funny, even though the subject matter is not funny. There are a lot of humorous moments in this film, especially when something really dramatic is about to happen. There's this comic relief. So we have this shot that's gonna show us what Hannibal Lecter has done in the cell, killing the two cops. And in this shot, we see a copy of Bon Appetit magazine.
That's right. So when Charles Napier is clearing the table of the drawings and the camera very, very briefly moves across the table and we see an edition of Bon Appetit magazine.
So you know that apparently Anthony Hopkins was dating Martha Stewart at the time.
No.
Yeah.
No.
But she could not divorce the idea of Hannibal Lecter from Anthony Hopkins, so the thing didn't end well.
Where did you find that, TMZ?
Actually, IMDb trivia.
I think we should also mention the incredible use of point of view shots in the film.
Yeah. Do we want to explain what a POV shot is or subjective camera is?
Yeah, so something that Demi has used in other films, but not nearly to the same level as Silence of the Lambs at that point, is the subjective camera, which is having the camera, the point of view of the character, what they see, is presented on camera. So, for example, if a person is walking into a restaurant, you see what that person is seeing, you see the tables, and the camera will move across the room. So we see this in the very early stages of Silence of the Lambs when Clarice is going down to meet Lecter. Everything is from her point of view. She talks to Barney the guard, and we see Barney the guard looking directly into the camera. And this happens over and over in the film. I think is something that we really do associate with Demi. However, of course, it's been used many, many times throughout film history. Scorsese is a big fan of this, and talking directly to camera, breaking the fourth wall, is a trademark of his as well.
And of course, one classic scene that's been compared to the use of POV camera in Silence of the Lambs is one scene done by Hitchcock in Shadow of a Dove, when Uncle Charlie is talking about why he hates women, why he hates widows. There's a moment when he makes a point, and he's shot from, like, he is in profile for all the time. But when he makes a point, he looks at Charlie, his niece, into her eyes. So we see the point of view of Charlie, and when she realized that her beloved Uncle Charlie may not be
it's such a wonderful person. And perverse movie.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen it, Shadow of a Doubt is one of the great Hitchcock films. What this type of shot brings, of course, is intimacy, and it brings you, the audience, into the world of the film. And it's used to great effect in this particular movie, but it's also there in other Demi movies like Something Wild. It really is an affecting camera technique, and something that I don't think anyone has really used to produce such raw images. Certainly people break the fourth wall, characters turn to camera, but very few people have used it in long scenes of dialogue, like the Lecter and Clarice scenes.
It really allows you to live the story through the eyes of the person and really walk in the shoes of the protagonist.
So let's turn to the film's cultural legacy. Maria, there are very few films that have the impact of A Silence of the Lambs.
I mean, it's the first film where the hero is a very dangerous serial killer that's also a likable character. Jonathan Demme was saying that when he watched the film in the theater, audience were cheering when Lecter escapes.
And the film was well received by critics.
Roger Ebert loved it, but let's say his sparring partner, Siskel, didn't like it at all. He said it was going to bomb. So Ebert, after that, sometimes he would make fun of the way he misjudged
Siskel's approach to the film. Yeah, I don't think there were many critics that I was reading in the early 90s who disliked the film. I think that it was almost unanimous. People loved the film, and they went to see it in great numbers.
Yeah, I mean, from an initial budget of $19 million, it made something like $272.7 million US.
Right, so I'm guessing that for that time, that was probably the worldwide grosses, because it is an R-rated movie. The film, of course, was also a kind of pop cultural icon. With the exception maybe of The Godfather, there are very few films that had that kind of cultural impact, that kind of cultural resonance, right? How many films can you take so many quotable lines from? Drop the gun, take the cannoli. Yes, The Godfather does it. Apocalypse Now, there are many great lines in that film, but in terms of the recognizable scenes, I think that this film would beat out Apocalypse Now even.
I think so too.
Just starting with parodies. I mean, there was Simpsons, South Park, Family Guy. They've all had at least one Chianti and fava bean scene. Then there are films like Dumb and Dumber, countless internet memes, of course. And then you have the impact on more serious films, the work of David Fincher, for example, Seven, Gone Girl, and in particular Mindhunter, which I believe was drawn from the same material. And finally, the work of Paul Thomas Anderson, Demi's, I guess, protege, who has been very clear in his love of Demi's subjective camera use.
I was happy to rediscover this classic. I discovered so many things that I didn't catch the first time I saw it because I was too entangled in the plot and in the terror
the violence, yeah.
and the violence. But, I loved Jonathan Demme's films. I love his heroines. I love Angela in Married to the Mob and Something Wild. So it was really great to see Clarice in the lineage of female characters portrayed by Jonathan Demme.
Exactly. In Silence of the Lambs, Demme is elevating the film beyond the source material, and he creates a lived-in world. It's a horror thriller, which to me is alive today as it was 30 years ago when it was made. And Werner Herzog has that phrase, and I'm not going to do the voice, but Herzog talks about a hero of cinema. For me, Demme with this film and with his other films, Stop Making Sense and Something Wild, which you mentioned, Demme's truly a hero of cinema. At his best, the narrative films feel like documentaries, and his documentaries feel like narrative films. Look at the way he shot This Must Be the Place in the Talking Heads film, Stop Making Sense. It's about emotion, it's about empathy. He's all about breaking down the fourth wall and connecting with us, the audience. And that is why Silence of the Lambs, the only so-called horror film to win an Oscar for Best Picture, is as important today as when it was released 30 years ago. You've been listening to The Last Picture House. Be sure to let us know what you think of the show on Twitter, where we're at Last Peak House. Follow us on Facebook or on Instagram, where we're Last Picture House, one word. Thanks for listening.